Hi, welcome to the Worldview media channel. I'm here in beautiful Bendigo, and this city has had some interesting developments recently. It's been the centre for protests against the building of a mosque, and it's made national and international news. The population of this town seems somewhat threatened and intimidated by the fact that the small Muslim population here in Bendigo want to build a place of worship. Now, I could talk a lot about whether or not it's appropriate in a country like Australia to be imploring the government to be banning religious activity. I instead want to talk about the obligation of Christians to actually engage the Muslim population in talking about issues of faith. When seeking to share your faith with Muslims, there's some vital principles to adhere to if you want to gain any traction at all. The first point, respect. Now, we all want to be respected, and Muslims are just the same. And one common mistake many Christians make when they seek to try and share the Christian faith with Muslim people is that they feel that it's their duty to point out everything that's wrong with Islam. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not going to make you win friends and influence people. In fact, there's a good chance that if that's your approach, you're actually going to achieve the opposite. The first thing you want to remember if you want to persuade someone to your way of thinking is to extend common courtesy and respect. This is, after all, a universal social convention. There's little chance, if any, that you're ever going to persuade anybody to your point of view, no matter what it is, unless you show them some respect. The second key point in sharing your faith with anybody, but particularly with Muslims, is to listen. To actually take some time to learn about and understand what that other person believes. The big mistake Christians make when sharing their faith with Muslims is they assume that they know what Muslims believe. Now, they may have studied Islam, they may understand the technicalities of the basic tenets of faith of Islam, but that is no real indication of what the individual that you're facing actually believes. So one thing that I do when I speak to Muslims, whether it's sometimes it's on an aeroplane, sometimes it's on the street, or if I'm out doing active evangelism, one of the first things I do when I speak to Muslims is I ask them about what they believe. Now, I know a little bit Islam. Okay, I don't need to ask people what Muslims in general believe, but I want to know what the person I'm talking to believes. And so, if they feel that they are somehow deeply connected to their faith, I want to know why. And so I will ask them, for example, can you please tell me about Muhammad and what makes you admire him so much? And I will listen. You know, there's this thing that happens with people. If you will take time to listen to them and actually hear their story, you may spend half an hour listening to them, but eventually they're going to be curious about what you believe. So what I will do is, if I'm talking to Muslims, I want to know all about why a person believes what they believe. Like, I want to know why the individual that I'm talking to face to face believes in the tenets of Islam, and why they identify as Muslim, and what is the basis of their faith, what is the foundation of it. So you'll find that if you spend your time talking to people about these things and listening to what they have to say, eventually they will get curious enough to ask you what you believe, and then it will be your turn to speak. And I found that even if you spend an hour listening to somebody and you only get 1 or 2 minutes to talk at the end of that, you can achieve more by that approach than if you try to shove your beliefs down somebody else's throat. Nobody likes that. Nobody wants to be talked at. People want to be talked to. And listening is a key part of communication. The next thing I do when I'm communicating with Muslims, once I've conveyed my respect to them and I have listened to them and asked them about what they believe, what I will often do then is ask them, well, what's your spiritual experience been? How do you know that what you believe is true? And this is a challenge that I put to all kinds of people of different faiths. I will use this technique when I'm talking to Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, and it's a useful technique to speak to Muslims too, because religion is a funny thing. People will adhere to a belief system because it provides some kind of, well, there's many reasons. Sometimes it will provide them with a cultural identification. Sometimes people will derive, their social needs from the particular group that they're involved in. But cultural identity is a big thing. And sometimes people will maintain a belief system out of fear. Maybe they have a concept of God who is harsh and punishing, and he will penalize anybody who deviates from the prescribed religious code. And sometimes people adhere to it simply out of custom and tradition, that this is the way their parents were raised, their parents' parents, and so on. And so they won't question it. So it's actually good. It's actually a very good thing to ask people what their experience is and why they believe what they believe. And if they're people that have never given it a second thought, then what your questions will do is it will prompt them to think more deeply about what it is that they believe, and begin to ask themselves the question. It's a much more powerful thing, and a much more persuasive thing, if when you're talking to someone, you can actually lead them to the conclusions themselves, rather than you just telling them what you believe the answer is. And then, because they haven't done, nobody can take that leap and just jump from what they believe to what you believe. Nobody's capable of that. So prescribing people what they should believe and telling them what they believe is wrong is not going to get you anywhere. What you actually need to do is lead people in a process of discovery, where they begin to question for themselves what it is that they believe. And then you can begin to prompt them with the strategic questions they need to ask themselves that will lead them to the truth, to this discovery of truth themselves. I'm going to jump in here and tell you a story about a man that I had the unfortunate experience of sitting next to me on a plane out of Cairo to Dubai. And out of all my travels in the Middle East, this is the only young man that I could identify as being possibly with terrorist leanings. Possibly, well, he had some extremist views, put it that way. And he had the unfortunate experience of sitting next to me on an aeroplane and for 2 hours engaging me in conversation. And as soon as I sat next to him, I began to pray quietly, and I said, Lord, this is a young man, he's at the beginning of his life. Who knows what he's into, who knows what he believes. He was obviously a Muslim from the way he was dressed. And a short period into the conversation, it became evident to me that he was a particular kind of Islamist. He had been from another Arab country, and he had been in Egypt at a particular madrasa where he was receiving what seemed to me like extremist views. And I sort of cottoned onto this a bit when we talked about the terrorist bombing of a particular church in Alexandria, and he seemed to respond to the news of that with some delight, as if this terrorist attack on the church had fulfilled, some glorious objective. So from that and that's a very different reaction to what I've experienced when talking to most other Muslims about this kind of thing. So I kind of knew what I was dealing with straight away there, and so I began to engage him in conversation, and my wife, who was sitting on the other side, went to sleep, and so that was a good opportunity for me just to engage him in conversation. And so what I did was I asked him about his faith, and he was very happy to talk about it. He was exceedingly delighted that he got to sit next to this white Westerner and tell him all about Islam. And I was happy to learn and to see because I had a fair idea of what he believed, but I really, really wanted to know why he believed it. And so that was the focus of my questioning. And so for a long time, he was answering questions about Islam, and I focused on what was his reasons for believing it particularly. And I asked him, tell me about Muhammad. Why do you admire him? And this is also a key point. When you're talking about the Prophet of Islam, you're not going to get anywhere at all if you begin to denigrate and insult their Prophet. Now, I'm a Christian, and I wish everybody would believe as I do, but the fact is they don't. And so as an evangelist, what I'm interested in is getting people from a place where they believe, from what they believe to what I believe, which is I believe the truth. And you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. And I tell you, one of the surest ways to end a conversation and make sure you will never win a Muslim to Christ is to begin by insulting their Prophet. And there's no need for it. There's absolutely no need for it, for reasons which I will begin to explain later. But anyway, with this man, I sat and I listened, and he asked me what I thought of Muhammad. And I was very careful with my answer, and I was honest, and I said, well, look, I don't really know a lot about Muhammad, but I'll concede this much. He was a man that lived in ancient times, and he gained a big following, so he must have had some leadership skills, and really that's true. I mean, he was a man who had following. Now, we know from our own European history or Christian history that not all the men in our history who exhibited admirable leadership skills, were particularly men of virtue. But we still can find something good to say about them. And so I dug deep and I found something good to say about Muhammad, and because of that I won this guy over, and he listened, and I think he actually began to think that in me there may be some kind of potential convert, and that's fine if he wants to think that, but for me it was just an exercise in getting to know the man. So we talked extensively, and maybe for about, well, it must have been more than an hour, and then I asked him 2 questions. One, I said to him, and have you had any answers to prayer? And he said, he thought he was thinking hard, and he actually honestly replied, and he said, no, I've never experienced personal answers to prayer. I thought, that's interesting. I said nothing. I just smiled a little bit. And then I said, have you ever seen any miracles? And he quick to jump in, and he said, well, we know that miracles happened in the Quran. And I said, that's fine, but have you actually ever witnessed any? And again, he answered honestly, and he said, no. And so I said, I said nothing. And I just smiled. And I could see curiosity building up within him, because I wasn't going to volunteer any information until he requested it. And then he finally said, genuinely curiously, he said, what about you? Have you ever seen miracles? Have you ever had answer to prayer? And now it was my time to talk, because I had just come from spending time in Africa, and I had seen the Lord do some extraordinary things, as I have whenever I've traveled. And so I have an extensive library of testimonies to draw upon now that I've been walking with the Lord for 40 years. And so I pulled some of those things out, and I said, yes, I have seen God do some miraculous things. And I proceeded to tell him, and for the next 15 minutes he sat quietly while I recounted event after event of the way God has answered my prayer, and the way God has worked in my family, and the way that God has performed miracles in response to answer to prayer with myself and amongst other people that I know. And I could see him having an internal crisis. Without knowing it, what I had done within those few minutes is I had completely undone all the indoctrination he'd received at that madrasa in Cairo. And he was a young man in deep crisis, because suddenly everything that he'd assumed to be true about God and about Christians, he suddenly knew was wrong. And he went very, very quiet for the rest of the trip. And I just concluded with him, I said, you know, I would encourage you to read the Bible and understand that some of the things you've learned about Christianity are not true. And for example, Muslims believe we worship 3 gods, and so I explained the Trinity as best I could. And I just invited him to consider the claims of Christ, to read the Bible, and to come to God with humility and ask God to know the truth, to show him the truth, and to have the courage to do it. Because the thing is, this is another thing to remember, even especially when talking to Islamic zealots, is that they're not lacking in courage. These are people who oftentimes are prepared to put their lives on the line and make great personal sacrifices in pursuit of what they believe is true. Now that's actually something to be commended. The problem is, what they believe is not true. So if you can encourage a young man like that to exhibit the same kind of courage in his pursuit of truth. I said to him, you know, you're from a Muslim background, a Muslim culture. You know, if you accept what I say is true, there's going to be great personal cost for you in this. And so I challenge you to look into it and find out for yourself. Begin a dialogue with God and ask God to show you if Jesus is the Son of God, and to ask Him to come into your life and reveal Himself to you, and to begin a new life, knowing that the blood of Christ, the blood shed on the cross, has washed away your sin. You don't have to perform for God anymore. You can accept the free gift of God's grace and begin to follow Him. So he had no comeback for that, this young man. He had no comeback at all. He just sat silently, deeply reassessing his life and thinking about the future. Now, when we got off the plane, we parted company, and I don't know the end of that story, but I'm optimistic, because I believe that man was searching for the truth, and that man was trying to follow the truth sacrificially, and I gave him the good news. Now, what I hope to achieve from this is that Christians who think they're doing the right thing by highlighting the errors of Islam or insulting the Prophet of Islam, you know, it really achieves nothing. As followers of Christ, we're called to take good news to the world. We're called to lift up the name of Christ, not put down people or put down what they believe. Now, there's a place for studying comparative religions. There's a place for understanding what's right and what's wrong about different faiths. But in your relationship with people, it's important that you connect in a way that they can actually hear what you're saying and have a chance to respond to it. Otherwise, we might inadvertently find ourselves working for the enemy instead of working for God. So the other thing to remember in evangelism is that it's actually not... People have this misconception about evangelism. They think it's something we have to go out and do for God. I don't believe that at all. I believe that evangelism is something we do with God, that we are His co-workers, and that when we find ourselves in situations where we get the opportunity to testify to people of other faiths, that we can actually invite God into that situation and understand that we are co-workers. We are working on the same side of the Holy Spirit that's working in that person to bring them under conviction of sin and conviction of righteousness and conviction of judgment, so that they can reassess their lives and come to know Jesus. So the other point I would make is, once you've demonstrated your respect for people, once you've listened to them, once you've gained their trust and they have invited you to speak, and you've been able to testify to what you know to be true, then gently challenge them to search it out for themselves. People will never change their belief system unless they're convinced of the need to do so. And it's only when a person has a deep encounter with Christ themselves will they have the courage and conviction to take the necessary steps that they have to follow Him. The other thing I would say is that, you know, I know there's a place for apologetics and for expounding the rational defense for the gospel, and I'm not putting it down. But here's the thing. Jesus gave us a mandate and a strategy, and He said, go into all the world and make disciples. and he said, "Go and be my witnesses. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Now, what does it mean to be a witness? I think that there's a profound key in this concept of being a witness that a lot of believers don't really understand. People think they have to have an argument, that they have to advance an argument, or they have to persuade somebody to believe that what they believe. And I don't actually believe that's the case at all. Think about it. When you're called to be a witness in a court situation, what is your responsibility? Well, this is it. Your responsibility is to stand up and just courageously say what you've seen and heard. To testify to what you've seen and heard, what you've witnessed. And that is a key point to be made about evangelism. Not all of us are in a position to really argue the case, and if we don't understand, for example, the historicity of the Bible, or if we don't understand the tenets of belief of other faiths, then obviously in all areas our knowledge is limited. But you can be the most simple person. You could actually be a child or a person with limited intellectual capacities, and you can have an encounter with Christ which is undeniable and profound. And if you can find the opportunity and the courage to actually tell people what you've seen and heard and experienced, that has the capacity to change the world. And it has the capacity to change the world because this is actually the Holy Spirit's strategy. This is what the Holy Spirit will do with your testimony. And when you look back at the history of the church, that's the way the gospel is advanced. Now, somebody made the observation, I read in a book years ago on church growth, there's something like 90% of people who come to Christ through the shared testimony of a friend, or being invited to church by a friend where they encountered other people's testimonies. And so this principle of giving testimony, and that being what the Holy Spirit uses to bring conviction, that is actually God's whole strategy. It's actually, remember, in New Testament times, people didn't have the Bible as we had it today. That was only compiled later. And so people were sent out into the hostile world to bear witness to what they'd experienced of Christ, or what they'd seen and what they'd heard. And the calling is the same today. The power of the gospel to advance in the world today will happen through our testimony, simply telling people what we've seen and what we've heard. So I hope this video has been meaningful to you. And I hope seriously that this alters and influences your way to approach Muslims. Now, another thing to remember about Muslims is not every Muslim is an Islamist. I have travelled a lot to the Middle East, and I've spent time in Jordan and Egypt and Israel, and I've encountered many Muslim people, many of which I would trust with my life. Far from being Islamist, many Muslims, they don't even read the Quran. They have what we call a nominal faith, where their concept of God is not too dissimilar from the concept of God shared by many nominal, non-church-going people who would regard themselves as Christians in the West. They see that the imperative of their faith is to live a good life, to be honest, to actually be good neighbours and friends, And as I've travelled in the Middle East, I've been very, very surprised by the extent of genuine warmth, love, generosity and hospitality extended to me by many Arab Muslims. And so, you know, the Hollywood stereotype doesn't fit with reality. You know, if you see the way Muslims are depicted in the movies, they're nearly always radical Islamists and terrorists. And I know those people exist, but they really are the minority. And the trouble is, people here in the West, they get these stereotypical views of people, and then when Muslims come, they're asylum seekers coming to settle in Australia. They think that this is the kinds of people that are going to move in next door, or you know, be planning terrorist attacks in the mosque. And look, I'm very, very, I have to admit, I'm very, very disappointed by the reaction of some Christians regarding their attitudes towards asylum. One of the prerequisites for any kind of evangelism is that we actually love and care for the people that we're trying to reach. Now, unfortunately, as I've alluded to in the message, I've heard lots of Christians relate to Muslims and Islam in general in a way that's completely devoid of any kind of love, respect or care. This actually causes me to question the veracity of their faith, because how can you claim to be a follower of Jesus unless you do the things that Jesus said? And Jesus said to love our enemies. It said to go into the world and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And one of those commandments is to love. Jesus said, love your enemies. And you know, I have come over a period of time to really love Muslim people and to love my conversations with them, to the point where I can really say with absolute certainty that I would be just as happy or happier to have Muslim people as my neighbours than some of the people, some Australian people. If you've had the unfortunate experience of living next to the neighbour from hell, as I have on occasions over the course of my life, you will know that not all Australians make good neighbours. And I can honestly say that since I've been dealing more frequently with Muslims, I would be very happy to have the Muslim people I know as my neighbours and my friends. So I hope this message is an encouragement to some. I know for some people this is going to be controversial, but let me just challenge you again. If you claim to be a Christian, then it's incumbent upon you to live as Jesus lived, and to go into the world and to be his witnesses, and to love your neighbours, to love your enemies, even your ideological enemies. So thank you for listening.